so the markets are in absolute and utter turmoil right now, and yet Uncle Bullish is here to help you see through the madness right now. I was in really good company yesterday. I said we're gonna go bullish tomorrow. Tomorrow being today, Monday, right? I said we're gonna go bullish. I was in really good company because I was basically the only one tweeting that. And here's my thoughts about what's going on right now. I do not believe that we are going to be sitting in an environment of low liquidity for long. I think that all these other countries are going to use this as an excuse to light up the money printers and print the living shit, in exact terms, out of their currencies. And I think that started with, the groundwork started with China coming out and saying that Trump is basically bullying us with these tariffs. I think that the hesitation that we should have around what I'm saying is the fact that a lot of these tariffs were put on and specifically highlighted currency manipulation. So I think that is a cause for pause, let's say, right? However, overall, I think that these countries are going to ramp up their money printers and basically assist their businesses to maintain profit margins, maintain their employees, et cetera, et cetera. I think as soon as that happened, Bitcoin started riding up. We're only down 1.56% on Bitcoin right now. I think the NASDAQ basically jumped up and started, approaching, filling the futures gap that was created. Look, I don't think this is going to be easy. I think that you even had Tom Lee sort of capitulate and say, his firm mistook and misunderstood exactly what was going to happen with the Trump tariffs and Liberation Day. But I think overall, this is a game of liquidity. I think there's a multiple faceted game going on here. And I think on the one hand, President Trump obviously wants to reorganize world trade. I think that, it can be a good thing, bad thing. We'll find out. We'll see what happens. This is the first time, certainly in my lifetime and in many people's lives, that, we're moving from a globalized world to a non-globalized world. We had the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, come out and say globalization era is over this morning. So I think that there is a lot changing here. And in that lot changing, remember, there always needs to be an excuse to print money worldwide. Now, I don't think money printing is going to come like it did with COVID, where everyone basically said, we're going to print money, and give it out to people. I think it's going to be much more controlled, much more planned out. And I think that money printing is basically going to be for business assistance, right? Which is obviously going to pump markets. And I know that the Trump administration has said that they don't want to print money. I get it. And I'm not saying that they will be the ones to do it. I'm saying that central banks and everybody else is going to come out here and start offering liquidity to markets to stabilize markets based on what's going on. I mean, Singapore had its worst market day in 16 years, I believe. The Chinese markets are falling off a cliff. All of the Asian markets are falling off a cliff. There's reason for that too, by the way, because if the end goal is to drive liquidity and manufacturing and everything back to the US, well, all these markets are going to suffer. And so people are repricing their value based on what's going on here. But look, I think for Bitcoin, the one thing that matters above all else, and I think this is extremely important to understand, the one thing that matters for Bitcoin above all else is liquidity. And liquidity is going to flood into the market. Liquidity is coming. I don't care what the Trump administration, what any other country says, liquidity is about to be flooded into the markets. And you can see how that's sort of being laid up here as blaming the Trump tariffs in order to print that much money. Obviously, they used COVID as an excuse to print that much money. And now they need to use the Trump tariffs as an excuse to print that much money. This is all the games that are being played here. Global liquidity is about to expand. And that means only one thing for Bitcoin. It means that we're going up. Now, we may see some more further downside in the market short term, but overall, this is all leading up to a couple things, and the peak thing on that list being liquidity. Liquidity, liquidity, liquidity. Everything is liquidity. And you've got to understand, there is no way that central banks are going to sit around, no matter what the Trump administration wants to say, and not provide markets liquidity. And they're probably already talking and planning out exactly what to do in case this thing gets even more crazier with drawdowns in the market, right? So liquidity is coming. Liquidity is the name of the game. That's what we're sitting here waiting for. And then remember, that's exactly what happened in COVID, right? What happened was everyone was selling off. The market was selling off, selling off, selling off. And then the Fed came out and the U.S. Congress came out with a plan to support and pump liquidity into the markets. And then we had a sharp V-shaped recovery, which is kind of like what always happens, right? There's always a V-shaped recovery. The question is how much pain is going to be needed for that V-shaped recovery to take place. And if you're sitting here with cash, liquid, waiting to purchase, something very important, by the way, happened on Friday. A lot of people were using the word decoupling. I never use that word because I don't think it is a true decoupling. But there was a moment on Friday. So imagine this, $40 billion of equities were sold on Thursday. And then on Friday, you're looking at the markets going, wait a second, the NASDAQ is down 6%. The VIX is on a 50% pump in a day, which is basically the fear index. And Bitcoin is up 1.8%. How does that make any sense? The reason why that was important was that TradFi had to stop and analyze that this past weekend. The fact that they've had to actually stop and go, wait a second, the NASDAQ was down 6%. The VIX was on a 50% pump. And Bitcoin was up, completely and utterly reframed the questioning that they had for Bitcoin. That's what was important. The fact that they had to stop and look at Bitcoin, gold was down, everything was down, right? Is extremely important. Bitcoin has a complete reframing from a TradFi perspective on Friday. And a lot of retail would never understand that, right? So I'm here to explain to you that that was a very important moment on Friday. And now when this capital is being allocated, Bitcoin will receive a different allocation level compared to what it has received up till now. But overall, this game is about liquidity, and liquidity is coming. Liquidity is going to come from all different angles of the earth, and then, of course, the U.S. liquidity is going to come. Remember, we went from the likelihood of one cut this year to the likelihood of basically 5 rate cuts this year, skyrocketing based on these tariffs. So there's a couple different things that the tariffs are aimed to do. Number one is help refinance the debt, but also to drive liquidity and to provide reason for liquidity to enter the markets. And remember, the Trump administration can provide certainty anytime they want. Literally, all they've got to say is we've struck deals with everyone, and we're now at a baseline of 10% or 0 tariffs. And by the way, if you are a free trade, a free trade supporter, what President Trump is doing here is actually quite good, right? Because if it does force half of the world to move towards free trade with the U.S. and move towards an alignment with U.S. direction, personally, look, from my perspective, I live in the UAE. It's a very pro-U.S. Country. That's one of the reasons why I live here. The currency is pegged against the U.S. dollar. We get free access basically to U.S. markets being a resident here. So the pro-U.S. agenda is extremely good, and it's one of the mistakes that I think my country has made after Brexit. The UK basically decided to say, hey, we still want to be friends with our neighbors, rather than thinking economically, strategically, and saying, what we should do is look at where the wind is blowing and align ourselves to whatever the strongest player is in the game. China is, of course, got to be shitting themselves, because not only is manufacturing being moved away from China, but generally speaking, the US is now supporting the number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 around manufacturing, which is basically, in India, Indonesia, Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. And so the issue has been with the tariffs, and what's caused the shock in the market is that last time during COVID, they were told, okay, you got to diversify your supply chains away from China. So they did, and they went to India, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. And now they've said, right, from 3 days time, 4 days time, whatever, you are going to be taxed, even though you've moved your supply chain to the countries that we said you should move it to, unless you now move it back to the US. And so, there's basically a lot of uncertainty that's happened here. One way the US could print money without making it sound like they're basically printing money is to basically say that they are going to print money to support businesses who want to move their supply chain to the US, and they're going to fund them. There's lots of different ways that money printing can be done. It doesn't have to be we're going to print money and hand it out to the peasants, which is what they did in COVID, which is what caused the majority of the inflation, right? So there's a lot of money printing strategies that can be used here. I'm looking forward to see what they use. My prediction is the Federal Reserve will come out and offer guaranteed liquidity, to depending on how bad this gets, will offer guaranteed liquidity and credit. Again, the moment this starts affecting credit markets, the Federal Reserve will be out, and that's what Jerome Powell has always done. Jerome Powell is the hero that you need when you thought that the hero that you wanted was Donald Trump. But Jerome Powell is the hero that the world needs, and he will suit up as he has done every single crisis since he got into office, and he will be there. We believe in Jerome Powell and President Larry Fink. All of this other stuff is noise and designed to move the markets in certain directions to allow rationale for these other things that need to happen. And one of those other things that needs to happen is global liquidity needs to expand. So we must provide a platform. We must provide an excuse for that global liquidity to be provided, and that excuse will be Trump tariffs. So, and again, when that liquidity comes flooding in, there's only one thing that happens for Bitcoin, and that is that Bitcoin goes through the roof. I'm even much more bullish as fuck than I was last week, based on thinking through this over the weekend and going, the only solution here is more liquidity. And as that liquidity comes in, the better it is for Bitcoin. Because ultimately, there are always only 3 rules to Bitcoin. Step number 1, you buy Bitcoin. Step number 2, shut the fuck up. And step number 3, you get fabulously wealthy.